Well, this is a video I never wanted to make, but here I am, July 22nd, 2025, and I'm sure you've all heard the news that the late Ozzy Osbourne has passed. I'm having a difficult time trying to formulate the words to describe how I feel about this, but I'm going to try. Ozzy and Black Sabbath, it actually started with Black Sabbath, but Ozzy was the icon for me, the musical icon. He was my musical hero. I first heard of Black Sabbath, or actually saw Black Sabbath in a weird way, back in 1970 when I was just a wee tyke. I was about 5 years old, around Seattle, Washington. My mom had a friend who had a record collection, and I remember going through it, not knowing really what anything was. I was too young to really understand. But I came across the very first Black Sabbath album and the witchy woman on the front, and it scared the hell out of me. And I know I'm not the only one that has the same story. And it wasn't until a few years later that I actually heard the album, and it wasn't until a few years later that I actually started listening to Black Sabbath on a conscious level. Again, 5 years old, you're too young to really know these things. But I did hear some of their songs on the radio. Back then, you had Iron Man, Paranoid, and War Pigs, and things of that nature. And FM radio played a lot of deep cuts. So I know there were other songs that were from the Sabbath albums that weren't singles. And Sabbath really wasn't a singles band. They only released one or two maybe, and then just decided, you know what, we're just going to do just albums and tour. But it wasn't until the late 70s that I actually started consciously getting into Black Sabbath. So it was around the time of Technical Ecstasy that I really started learning about Black Sabbath, and Ozzy became an actual name in my conscious. And then, of course, in 1981 comes along with Blizzard of Oz and his two albums with Randy Rhoads, Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman. And those 2 years when those albums came out, Ozzy was a force of nature that people like Gen Z and the millennials don't really understand. That heavy metal was somewhat relatively new to the scene. I mean, heavy metal existed in the 70s, but it was still mostly considered hard rock. And then you had Judas Priest came along and put the denim and leather and whips and studs and all that, became sort of the heavy metal look. But beforehand, it was like acid rock or psychedelic rock with a really hard edge. And it wasn't until the 80s that heavy metal became an actual thing, and Quiet Riot's album Metal Health became like the first real popular heavy metal album. But Black Sabbath was the pioneers of heavy metal. They came out with the first heavy metal album, which was their first album, Black Sabbath, the one that scared me, the album cover. But throughout my youth, especially through the 80s, Ozzy was at the forefront of everything for me in terms of music. Now, I listen to a wide variety of music. I identify with the goth subculture and the metal subculture, and I listen to a lot of 60s psychedelic acid rock as well, and I listen to some classic rock too, REO Speedwagon and things like that. But for me, Black Sabbath was it. It was the band for me, and it always will be the band for me. I love Led Zeppelin, I love The Cure, things of that nature, but for me, Black Sabbath is the beginning and the end of heavy rock and dark rock for me. I remember Bill Ward called Black Sabbath downer rock. I guess you could call it that. Some call it doom rock, some call it stoner rock, some call it just plain old hard rock or heavy metal. I don't think it really matters what you call it. But Black Sabbath was the fountainhead for a lot of different music genres. You had grunge. I was around Seattle at the time. Grunge was starting to become a thing. Then I left Seattle, Washington State actually, and moved to eventually to Southern California just when grunge became popular. But you could hear Black Sabbath in the DNA of grunge. And I remember when I was living in Washington State, we all listened to Black Sabbath, and amongst other bands as well. But Black Sabbath was a primary influence among a lot of the grunge musicians of the time. early goth. A lot of early goth musicians, like Roz Williams, for example, were huge fans of Black Sabbath. I was watching an interview with Budgie, who is the drummer for Susie and the Banshees, and he even mentioned Black Sabbath and their drummer, Bill Ward, who, in my opinion, is one of the best rock drummers out there. And in fact, a lot of the best rock drummers out there started off as jazz drummers, and Bill Ward was a jazz drummer, along with others like Ginger Baker of Cream and Ginger Baker's Air Force, and what's the other one? Blind Faith with Eric Clapton as well. They tended to take rock into a whole different dimension, and that's one of the great things about Black Sabbath was their adventurism in music, how they explored different sonic landscapes. But Ozzy, he was the everyman. He was what John Lennon called a working class hero. Ozzy quit school at age 15. He worked a variety of low-paying, dead-end jobs in Birmingham, and his father went deep into debt to buy him a PA, which is basically 2 speakers and a microphone. And Ozzy worked hard. He was a hard worker. He performed. He honed his craft, and he's proof that you can come from a background of minimal means, work hard, apply yourself, do the right thing, and you too can become something. You can become noteworthy. And of course, some of his noteworthiness was due to some outrageous activities on his part. We won't really dwell over that, but that's all part of the legend of Ozzy Osbourne. And growing up in the 1980s, like I mentioned earlier, he was a force of nature. He was in the news constantly. People were trying to protest him, boycott him about, oh, he's a Satanist and all that, which couldn't be further from the truth. Ozzy was never a Satanist. He never glorified Satan. Yes, he sang about Satan, but these were warnings about the occult and Satanism and things of that nature. If you listen to the Black Sabbath album Master of Reality, which I happen to have right here, it's my favorite Black Sabbath album of all time. There's a song called After Forever, which is an explicit song about Jesus Christ and Christianity and how those who reject Jesus are not going to be saved. They're going to meet a rather unpleasant end to their life. The symbol for Black Sabbath, if you will, and Ozzy has been the Christian cross. Ozzy's always been photographed with a cross around his neck. In fact, when Black Sabbath first started, his father made homemade crosses for the band to wear. Later, they were replaced by more professional and nicer looking crosses. But from the beginning, they were explicitly Christian. And a lot of their songs were basically moralistic in nature. They were warnings about drugs. They were warnings about war and government power. They were warnings about the getting involved in the occult, things of that nature. But people who have preconceived notions about things didn't really explore the meaning behind these songs and the rationale behind them. And they just wrote them off as like, oh, Black Sabbath and Ozzy, they're just a bunch of devil worshippers, which is, again, further from the truth. And anybody that still maintains that is willfully ignorant and actually lying. At this point, especially with the internet, no one should be that ignorant about people like Ozzy Osbourne and Black Sabbath. He went through a lot of trials and tribulations in his life, and he always came through on top. He is the Iron Man that he sang about back in 1970 on the album Paranoid. Many times Ozzy could have been written off as a has-been or a loser or whatever like that, and he always fought his way back. He was a tenacious, a dedicated individual, and I really admired that, and he's been an influence in that regard. When Randy Rhoads died in that plane crash in 1982 in Florida, the planes buzzed the tour bus and eventually clipped it, causing the plane to crash into a nearby house. And Ozzy could have easily been killed on that, but through the grace of God, I guess you could say, he survived, and he plowed on with his career. Just a week after the crash, he appeared on Late Night with David Letterman, and I remember watching this particular episode because I was a huge Late Night with David Letterman fan back in the day. And Ozzy came out dressed head to toe in black, and his personality was subdued, very much so, because he was being marketed as like the rock and roll madman at the time. And that's when the whole Prince of Darkness came about, was during that time. When he was in Black Sabbath, he wasn't referred to really as the Prince of Darkness. But when he went solo, that really became part of his image. He came out a week after this tragedy and discussed it briefly, and regrouped, got a new guitar player, and kept trudging along. The man, again, was a force of nature that could not be stopped. You know, his escapades with drugs, his brushes with the law, things of that nature. You know, his infidelity with Sharon. That could have ended his career because she was his manager. You know, if they got divorced, would she still be his manager? Maybe not. What would happen to his career afterwards? Who knows? But let's not dwell on the negatives. But those negatives do really point to a man who's very tenacious and very hardworking. He did not take anything for granted, and he did not take his fans for granted either. He was very humble about it. He was very grateful about his fans. And his recent farewell concert, the Back to the Beginning concert in Birmingham at the Villa Park, I believe it's called, where soccer. I'm not a big knowledgeable person about the soccer or football, whatever you want to call it, in England, but it's a field that this team played. I think it's Aston. You feel free to go ahead and correct me in the comments below, but you know what I'm talking about if you're aware of the concert. It was put on. Ozzy wanted one last show. He wanted one last show to say goodbye and thank you to his fans. He had been laid up with numerous health issues, basically saying he'd been laying on his back for a few years, and he tried. He said in a recent interview that he was working hard to try and bring himself up to have enough energy to last through two different sets, one with his solo band and one with Black Sabbath, including the original drummer Bill Ward, who was brought back specifically for this. They all mended fences in that regard. So that's a positive outcome of the concert, is that the original members of Black Sabbath were able to bury the hatchet and reunite once again after 20 years. Now, I did see Black Sabbath on the End tour at the Tacoma Dome in Washington State, Tacoma, Washington. I saw them on their final tour with some of my high school friends. We used to imbibe in certain green leafy substances and listen to Black Sabbath constantly. And we reunited after not seeing each other for many, many, many years to go to this particular concert at the Tacoma Dome, which is going to be a lifelong memory for me. I may never see them again, but it holds a special place in my heart. And even though it was their last tour, that's why they called it The End, the tour. They had another drummer taking Bill Ward's place because there was a rift between Bill Ward and the rest of the band. So even though Black Sabbath had played more recently than 20 years, the original members hadn't played for 20 years together. So that was an absolutely awesome and heart-wrenching time to see them all on stage, knowing it's going to be the last time. It's so difficult for me to process this. I think on an intellectual level, a lot of us knew that this time was going to be coming. He was suffering from Parkinson's disease. When you saw him on stage, he was struggling, but he gave it his all. And there were numerous times you could see him sitting on his throne with his hands on the armrest, trying to push himself up. He wanted to get up so damn bad, for not only for himself, but for his fans, but just couldn't do it. And it was difficult to see that. But it was also, something that brought tears to my eyes, seeing him perform, knowing it's going to be the last time. But like I said, we all knew intellectually that this time was going to be coming. Parkinson's is one hell of a disease. And you could tell it was affecting him. But on another level, it's like for somebody who's been in my life, especially for so long, since I was like 5 years old in 1950, you can do the math on my age, seeing him do this and seeing his struggles and all that, you think, he's the Iron Man. He can keep going. He can keep going. But on a deeper level, this isn't going to be forever, and the end's going to come a lot sooner than we wish. And well, it finally did. When I first heard the news about 4 hours ago, it was just minutes after the family had announced it, and it just hit the news. I thought, no way, come on, this isn't true. This is BS. This is fake news. It's like Peter Steele when he, typo negative. There were a couple instances where they announced Peter Steele had died, and it was all a big joke, or it was fake. And I thought, maybe out of irrational thinking that I thought, well, this is just a joke. You want to deny reality. But I knew deep down that this was probably true. And I cried my eyes out. I'll admit it. I cried my eyes out. And I probably still will shed a few more tears. Because it's hard imagining a life without Ozzy Osbourne. He's been around the vast majority of my life. I only lived 5 years without knowing who this guy was or knowing who Black Sabbath was. And he'd seen me through, his music has seen me through good times and bad times. When I had nobody to count on in life, I could always listen to Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne to bring me joy and to bring me comfort and to help me maybe sometimes let loose some pent-up anger. Because there were some songs like War Pigs and Children in the Grave that I could really unleash my anger by listening to it. And it always brought me back down to earth. In times of sorrow, songs like Changes or Solitude off the Master of Reality album, those help. And then there was just some flat out bangers like Symptom of the Universe off the Sabotage album. And I believe Sabotage was Ozzy's finest moment in terms of the Black Sabbath discography. He was a man possessed because the band was going through so much horrible things regarding their management and whatnot that they were just angry. And some say that was actually the very first thrash metal song to ever come out. And like I said, the band was a fountainhead for so many different genres. Grunge, thrash metal, metal itself, doom metal, stoner rock, and yes, even goth music, I believe, owes a significant credit to early Black Sabbath, not the later Black Sabbath, but the first 3 albums definitely, which is the self-titled Black Sabbath album, the second one, Paranoid, and the third one, Master of Reality, the one I held up earlier. The colors of purple and black, it's morning colors, down-tuned, very gloomy. The first album has the rain and the tolling bell, dirgy sort of music. Without Black Sabbath, a lot of different music genres may not exist, or it would sound much different than what it does now. So imagine a world without Black Sabbath and Ozzy Osbourne. It's very difficult to imagine. Some say, it's corny or trite or whatever. Someone called it trite earlier that I was talking to. That, your music saved me. So many people say, your music saved me. And it seems kind of corny, I suppose, to say something like that. But in reality, yeah. What would have I done without Black Sabbath's music and without Ozzy's music? I really don't know. It was, I think, in a lot of ways a saving grace for me. And I know it was a saving grace for many of you watching this as well. I don't know if there's much more I can really say on the matter. There's so many people putting out tributes to Ozzy right now. And deservedly so. The man, as far as I'm concerned, should have been knighted a long time ago. He should have been Sir John Michael Osbourne, or Sir Ozzy Osbourne, as he's more popularly known. I really feel sorry for Sharon. I mean, he was her everything, and she was his everything. I feel sorry for Kelly and Jack and Amy, the daughter who's not really seen very much. Lewis, his son from his first marriage to Thelma. To Jessica's other daughter, who nobody really knows much about. She's an actress, Jessica Osbourne. You can look her up on Google. She's not around a whole lot, but she is an actress and she has appeared here and there. I feel sorry for all of them, and it's always difficult losing a loved one, especially a parent. I've lost my mom, I've lost my father. I never knew my father, but I kind of put a period at the end of that last year when I went and visited his grave after discovering who he was. That's a whole other story. But, I've lost my grandparents, so I know what it's like to deal with death and tragedy, and it's difficult. And I know this is the first for Kelly and Jack and the kids. They haven't dealt with a death of a parent yet. So my heart goes out to all of them, and I know they loved Ozzy deeply. And it really breaks my heart knowing, because I saw a video that Jack Osbourne had posted a few days ago of his daughter, Ozzy's granddaughter, sitting at their house watching a film of Ozzy, and she's going, "Papa, Papa, Papa." Anyway, have a good one, and in honor of Ozzy, peace out.